Governments talk about it all the time, running a deficit. Deficit this, deficit that. But when it comes to the automobile industry, what type of new vehicles actually have more of a deficit towards the economy than any other ones? Electric vehicles are running a massive deficit, and people don't understand how much of a deficit it's actually causing us and how much it's going to cost us in the future. EVs may seem like a good idea, but their added weight is going to increase the cost to not only us, but the world around us. So today, AutoLooks is going to take a look at the EV deficit and how we can help us clean up this automotive financial mess. Welcome back to the AutoLooks podcast. I'm your host, as always, the doctor to the automotive industry, Mr. Everett J, coming to you from our host website at AutoLooks.net. If you haven't been there, stop by, check it out, read some of the ratings, check out some of the reviews, go and read some articles that we have posted about automobiles from all over the globe, inclusive of our design reviews, which we try and release at least a new one every week. And at the end of our year-end review, plus our complete ratings for the best, the worst, the copycats, and everything in between from the AutoLooks rating system and the AutoLooks A+ awards, all on our host website, AutoLooks.net. The AutoLooks podcast is brought to you by Ecom Entertainment Group and distributed by Podbeam.com. If you'd like to get in touch with us, send us an email over to email@AutoLooks.net. So like I said in the beginning, an automotive deficit. Yes, the EV industry is causing a massive EV deficit that we're not even aware of. But AutoLooks is going to take a look at it today. Being an owner, you'll understand this very quickly. And right now, we're starting to see the fallout from the first-time buyers understanding the added costs that EVs can incur. You save overall at the pumps. But now, as electricity is becoming more and more cumbersome to come by, increases to rates is starting to happen. Governments are starting to realize there's more of a demand for it, which means we are now being charged more during peak hours, daily times, between 6 a.m. and 7 p.m. than any other time before. Sure, we all know we're supposed to do our laundry either on the weekends or at night to try and reduce our costs due to the fact that dryers use up the most amount of electricity in our house for any of our appliances next to our freezer and refrigerator, but we can't really stop those ones. They need to run 24/7. Where our dryer, we can pick and choose. It's a variable cost, where our refrigerator and freezer are a fixed cost. But when it comes to the EV industry, there are a lot of variable costs that people don't understand. And we're going to take a look at that. Well, for starters, electric vehicles weigh in between 80 to 175% more than their ICE counterparts. Take a look at the Hummer EV. Yes, General Motors' brand new Hummer. Ooh, it's not a gas-guzzling pig. But if you listen to our podcast recently about the EV weight of destruction to the infrastructure, you'll understand about the weight significance of the Hummer EV. It weighs over twice as much as a standard GMC Sierra. That's a lot of weight. So in the footprint of one vehicle, we have the weight of two vehicles. And with that comes added stress onto both your tires and suspension system, along with all your welds. Now, we all know there's tons of people out there, giving Tesla tons of flack about these horrible welds and all these quality issues, but people don't understand that Tesla's way more than their ICE counterparts. So if that vehicle gets taken off of the transport or train in an improper manner, you're more likely to cause a tear or a rip in any of those major welds or spotted bead welds. Doesn't matter if it's strip or it's bead, you can cause a massive rip in it. A lot of people have noticed this when they get their vehicles and they first pull up in the driveway and they're like, what the hell is this? There's like a massive gap here, or there's a weld that's completely fucked up. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, but that may not have been on the factory floor. That could have been during transportation, hitting potholes on the highway. You have to remember, these transports that are now transporting these overweight EVs are transporting the same amount of vehicles in the same footprint as the ICEs, but are doubling up on that weight. And that more weight can cause damage to both the transportation infrastructure, the transportation method, and the vehicles themselves. We've all seen it recently in the past 20 to 30 years about a lot of these automobile companies starting to put plastic wraps or even transports, putting covers on the front of vehicles for transportation during wintertime or high times for seasonal deficiencies. We're talking about sandstorms, rock chips, heavy rainstorms, and even blizzards, damaging the paint of the vehicle before it arrives at the dealer lot. Well, this is the deficiency that we've learned to take care of. But now that we're transporting vehicles that are twice as heavy as before, we have to understand that these vehicles that are transporting them are under a lot of undue stress. And transportation companies are starting to realize there is an extra cost to moving these vehicles. Not just for the fact that if something were to happen, like I know a lot of people talk about electric vehicles, catching on fire and then being on fire for days upon days. Well, internal combustion engine vehicles catch on fire just as much as electric vehicles. The reason why we hear about electric vehicles a lot more is because the infrastructure behind it isn't properly maintained. And we covered this in a previous podcast about fix the issues. Well, all of these major issues with the infrastructure for the EV industry. Well, having improperly managed charging stations can cause more fires when more gas stations are attended by constant attendees. That gas station attendant that you see just sitting inside on their cell phone, browsing through Facebook all day, and you're like, why am I paying this person like in between 15 to like $20 an hour to sit here to just go on Facebook when I earn similar money and I gotta fucking work my ass off? Well, that person also notices all of the issues outside. So when one of the pumps isn't working, they know to call somebody. That doesn't happen in the EV industry, which just causes a deficiency in the infrastructure. But there's also a deficit when it comes to the costs incurred in your EV. Now, added weight causes added stress to a vehicle. And a lot of people don't know this. When you buy an EV, you're more likely to change your tires twice as fast as you will with an ICE. Now, I've noticed this in my time frame by going from front-wheel drive sedans back in the 90s to all-wheel drive CUVs now. The all-wheel drive system adds extra weight to my vehicles. My little Rio hatchback, the original tires, hell, I still have my original tires from when I bought that car that have nearly 100,000 kilometers on them, and I still have tread life. My aftermarket ones have about 30,000 kilometers on them and still have massive amount of tread life on them. My Suzuki with an all-wheel drive system, I've had to change the tires, and at 235,000 kilometers, it has had the tires changed 3 times. My RAV4 is just crossing the 80,000 kilometer time frame. And I'm used to vehicles having a 120,000 kilometer time frame before you got to make major changes like tires and suspensions. But my RAV4, I've already had to start doing brakes. I've already had to start doing my tires. And I'm already going to be looking at my suspension system only because this vehicle has the footprint of a Corolla, but has the weight of a Tacoma. So that added weight creates added stress. It creates a deficit in the amount of costs. In your EVs, you'll burn through tires much quicker. You may save on gas, but you'll burn through your tires and your suspension system a lot quicker than you would with a similarly laid out internal combustion engine vehicle. Now, Stellantis has already made it their high point of reducing the weight of battery capacities. Even Toyota is looking at it by trying to bring down the weight of a battery pack by 50% before the end of this decade, which would make EVs more in line with what ICE counterparts weigh today, which means they'll be reducing stress on the vehicles to make your tires and suspension system last even longer. But you also have to remember, if it weighs more, your brakes take even more. Well, now you have a brake deficit because you have to spend more money on this. You're replacing brakes closer and closer together. With an average person driving between 20 to 25,000 kilometers a year, yeah, I'm Canadian, I'm going by kilometers. Myself not included, most of my average vehicles are pretty close to 30,000 kilometers. My personal vehicle back and forth to work is about 20,000 kilometers. And that's only back and forth to work and here and about. So I'm a little above average, but the average consumer is between 20 to 25,000 kilometers a year on a standard vehicle that they utilize for all purposes. And if your life expectancy of your suspension, your brakes, and your tires is cut in half, you now go from that 100,000 threshold down to 60,000. I get it, that's not exact half, but you have to remember, you're driving less. But if you're doing a lot of stop and go, you're driving more. And that's one of those deficits that people don't understand. Sitting in stop and go traffic causes more wear and tear in your vehicle than full flow on the highway. My vehicles go a lot longer on our products than my in-laws or my brother and sister-in-law, because their vehicles are in stop-and-go traffic a lot more often than mine are. Living in Southern Ontario, they're more used to that, where when I get up, I drive 12 kilometers to my day job, and I can go at a steady pace on that main throughway in between 90 and 100 kilometers an hour, all the way straight through to work. Well, not all the way. There are two sections that get down to about 80 kilometers an hour, and one section right at the end that gets down to 60, but I still drive through at a flow-through rate at a steady pace. So I'm not causing as much damage to my products, which means I get longer life out of my tires, I get longer life out of my suspension, I get longer life out of my brakes. Well, maybe not so much the brakes, I'm pretty hard on mine, but if I drove like an average person, I would get more life out of my brakes than people living in major urban centers. But when the average person who owns an electric vehicle lives in a major center, they're going to be causing more added stress to those parts, which means they're going to create more deficiencies for their vehicle, and they're going to start running a deficit. Now, you may ask yourself, Everett, you're not really talking about a deficit here, you're talking about extra incurred costs for the EV industry. Yeah, I am. But in the later half of this podcast, you'll understand why this is all about a deficit for the EV industry. Because when you start adding all this weight, it adds more costs to your vehicle. You may be saving on fueling your vehicle, but you're spending more on parts for your vehicle. You now don't have to pay to fuel your vehicle with gasoline. You now don't have to change your oil every 5,000 miles. You now don't have to go in for maintenance calls as often. So you're saving there. But you have to change your brakes, your suspension, and your tires a lot sooner. And you're more likely to have rim damage. And with winter rims usually being out of just standard forged steel, they're more likely to be bent due to the added weight. But when those things start happening, they add into the bigger problem for the EV industry. The deficit we're talking about, and the reason why we started with the vehicle itself, is we need to explain to you that the added weight and the added cost to you are going to create a secondary deficit to the infrastructure you're driving on. In my hometown, before our city amalgamated, everybody always used to say, oh, before amalgamation, our roads were way better. Everything was just, we always had smoother roads. We always had less potholes. They got fixed better, and the government doesn't give us a fair share of tax revenue. Well, that's a half-true story. We literally, since amalgamation, we don't get our fair share of the gas tax, because we now get it based off of a city of 160,000 people, which actually is based off of population, not the actual density of the city and its size, where its size is greater than that of the Golden Horseshoe with a population of 6.5 million people. Okay, so there is truth to that. But since the city amalgamated, four-door trucks have come around, and the SUV market has exploded. Well, SUVs and trucks weigh more than your average sedan, which means when they drive on your roads, they create more stress on your roadways. And by having more trucks on the road, you have more weight on the road, which means you have more stress on the road. And when there's cracks that appear, they appear quicker and longer. And for that weight will eventually create potholes. And potholes are created by cracks that are formed due to deteriorating pavement, due to physical, ecological, and weight. The weight of all these trucks and SUVs on my city roads around me, inclusive of myself, because I do drive a vehicle that weighs a lot more than my car. See, in the summertime, I don't add as much weight to the infrastructure myself per se, because I drive a vehicle that weighs a lot less than the average vehicle driving around the greater city of Sudbury. But in the wintertime, I'm driving my truck, which weighs 2.5 times more than my little Kia Rio. So I'm increasing the weight being added to that. And when there are cracks on the road, I'm more likely to tear up the pavement than I am with my little car. I explained this to my wife the other day. What happens when you hit a pothole? When I hit a pothole in my little lowered Rio with low profile tires, it fucking hurts. Well, one, I got stiff suspension, and two, I also have low profile tires and solid steel rims. So it's not very comfortable. They don't have a sole purpose besides just standard straight line driving. But when I hit that pothole, I only hit the edge of it and keep going. When I nail that pothole in my Borrego, which weighs 2.5 times the weight of that, I create stress against the edge of that pothole, causing it to crack and deteriorate even quicker. Now, if I drive a Hummer EV, which weighs over 3 times more than my Borrego, and I hit the edge of that pothole, I not only crack the edge of that pothole, but I break away the pavement. And this is where the deficit comes into play. EVs, with their added weight on the roadways, which we've already talked about in a previous podcast, are causing more undue stress in an infrastructure they are not paying for. Remember that. Electric vehicles don't pay for the roadways that they drive on. Electric vehicles pay for the distribution network of the power going into them, and that's it. The only way an electric vehicle pays for the infrastructure that it drives is when they're bought, they pay taxes, and a portion of that tax goes to infrastructure. And the transportation of those vehicles is still done by internal combustion engine vehicles, which fuel with gas and are bought with paid taxes. So they pay into the infrastructure, and by paying the gas tax constantly, they're constantly paying into the infrastructure. It's not a one-time deal. So electric vehicles are essentially driving on the roadways for free. But wait a minute, Everett, didn't you just say that electric vehicles usually weigh between 80 to 170% more than their ICE counterparts? Well, yes, I did, Mr. Everett. I did. So what does that mean for the infrastructure? The more electric vehicles we have on our road, the more of an infrastructure deficit we're going to incur until governments realize that they need to start paying back into the infrastructure that they're utilizing. This is the same reason why select cities are now making people on bicycles register their bikes every year. Even though it may only be like a $60 registration fee for you to have a bicycle in the city of Toronto, you're still paying into a pot that goes into financing the development and the upkeep of the infrastructure that's being built for those transportation networks. But electric vehicles still aren't. They're paying for the distribution network. Well, in the province of Ontario, we're expanding our electrical grid extensively right now. The 4-lane highway still isn't finished in my home city. After 6 years of the PCs being in power, they have done fuck all, like 0% investment into our highway. But they have invested more into brand new electrical infrastructure going into remote northern communities. They're expanding the grid. Well, that's great, right? You're going to hook more people up. Well, it is great. But these people are starting to realize that the amounts they're paying once they're hooked up into the grid far exceed what their diesel generators that they have now were charging them. But why is that? Well, one, you have to pay for the infrastructure that's being developed and put into there, right? And two, colder climates. But what does that have to do with the deficit for the electric vehicles? Well, like I said, we've already covered that. We are not paying into the infrastructure that we're destroying. And even though more and more people are getting out of driving vehicles these days, especially in urban centers, and we're starting to get more development into light rail transit systems, subway systems, maglevs, hyperloop systems, like all of these systems on top of autonomous vehicles. So there's now less cars on the road. Well, good for you. Yay, you got some cars off the road, but it's not enough. The cars that are still on the road weigh more than they did. So out of every 10 people, if you can get 2 people off the road, but 6 of those people go out and buy an EV, you still incurred more of a deficit towards the infrastructure that has to support these vehicles. And without a payment back into it, how are you ever going to maintain it? Why do you think fuel prices are still going up? In Canada, our quack of a prime minister keeps telling us the carbon tax is being put in place to keep these companies from developing more carbon things. Well, in the past 6 years, our government has spent more money and invested more money into carbon producing industries than carbon zero industries. Tenfold. You can go online, check that out. For $150 million in the province of Alberta spent on brand new solar and wind power, $7.5 billion was invested into oil and gas. But these investments are being poured in to the industries that are still fueling the infrastructure that's being destroyed by the future of the transportation network. This deficit is going to keep growing. And the worst thing is the people who rely on the entry-level vehicles are being pushed out of the industry. And without those people, you're losing even more money and creating a larger infrastructure deficit. This doesn't just go for my home country, Canada. This goes for everywhere. As more heavy vehicles hit the roads, more damage gets done to our roads. And without a proper taxation system put into place to tax the new vehicles going onto the road that cause more damage to the road than the previous generation vehicles, we're going to have such a deteriorated infrastructure system in the future. By the time we realize we need to do something about it, it's going to be too late. The EV infrastructure out there and the deficit between the added expenses of owning your car to the added expenses of the infrastructure that you're utilizing are still there, and they're growing every year. Right now, with the drop in EV sales and people looking towards hybrids, which weigh 1, a little bit less than EVs, and 2, still put money back into the infrastructure that they utilize, it is time for governments around the world to grab the world by the horns horns and say we need to start finding a way to pay for the infrastructure of tomorrow that we require to change over to the electric vehicle industry. If we're still gung-ho about this and about putting all of our eggs into one basket, which is actually one of our previous podcasts, go and listen to it, then we need to start planning now so that 30 years from now, we don't have to create a brand new taxation system to tax the people to death just to pay for the infrastructure that was fucked up by our predecessors. The EV infrastructure deficit is here and it's growing every year. I notice it, and I notice it heavily by living in a city that already has a deficit of nearly $500 million. I said that right, $500 million for the city of Sudbury. A city of 168,000 people has that much of an infrastructure deficit in play. I look out at my front street and that roadway looks worse than the ones I just drove on in a third world nation. Yeah, I was on vacation in Cuba and their roads are better than nearly every road in the city of Sudbury. I look at the street out front of mine and it is cracked and it is literally hanging on by a thread. I drive roads to work that have potholes that get filled in on Friday and are back again open on Monday when I go back to work. That they are done such cheaply that people putting them in don't understand the vehicles that are driving on top of them. Until governments realize that this deficit is growing every year and getting worse and worse by the year, eventually, we're all going to be put into a place where we're literally just going to have to park our cars and start walking everywhere. They talk about the future of the 15-minute city, and even Toyota is looking at the future city, which does not have any vehicles. But why are car companies even looking at something like that for the future? Well, they're looking at it because they understand the infrastructure deficit that's growing right now and that's happening. But unlike the governments around the world, those auto companies know they can do something about it before it gets too big. They see decades in the future, not just a year or two. You have to remember, governments only see things on a 4-year term. General Electric is a company that you need to look at. General Electric actually has plans in place for future development of technology that looks 150 years into the future. Toyota looks at what the industry is going to look at in nearly 50 to 60 years into the future. But our governments only look at a narrow window of 4 years. So in the future, who do you think will be able to solve the infrastructure deficit being created by the electric vehicle industry? The auto companies or the government's footing the bill for the roads we drive on? I'm not trying to scare you all away from driving an electric vehicle, but I'm trying to point out the fact that there's a deficit that's growing substantially every single year. And without investment into this right now, like I'm talking right now, 2024, get your asses in gear and start investing in this or it's gonna get out of control. AutoLooks knows what's going on and the auto industry knows what's going on. But unfortunately, there's still a lot of us out there that are blinded by a future where we think everything is going. And until we actually open our eyes and see the world as it really is, none of us can be saved. So what do you think about the EV deficit and how it's growing? Do you really think the governments around the world are actually going to save us from this growing monstrosity that this industry is bringing about, the infrastructure that we drive on every single day? Do you think the governments around the world will wake up in time to save us from it without taxing us to death in the future? Send us an email or share this on social media and tell your friends about it. Tell them to listen in and get a little bit of information about what's going on with the rise of the EV industry. All from the AutoLooks podcast. So if you like this podcast, please like, share, or comment about it on any of the major social feeds, streaming sites, or anywhere that you have found the AutoLooks podcast. Save us, follow us, click the like button at the bottom, and share it with your friends. And then go to our website, send us an email, and check out some of our stuff on the AutoLooks.net website, and send us an email about what you think about the automobile industry and where we are headed. Do you really think we can be saved from the infrastructure deficit that's growing every year? Well, send us an email at email@AutoLooks.net. The AutoLooks podcast has been brought to you by Ecom Entertainment Group and distributed by Podbeam.com. The AutoLooks podcast is hosted by the one and only doctor to the automotive industry, Mr. Everett J. And if you'd like to have a word with him or even send him a message or want to say something on an interview page or even go head-to-head with them in the AutoLooks interview podcast, send us an email over at email@AutoLooks.net. So for myself, Everett J., the AutoLooks podcast and the AutoLooks.net website, strap yourself in for this one fun, wild ride that this growing deficit is about to take us on.